Hey, everybody, we are continuing our talk on the Nephilim. And in this talk, we are going to talk about the Nephilim after the flood, all the giants after the flood. It's really quite fascinating. I've spent a tremendous amount of time trying to trace this through the Bible and through history. So if you're ready, let's go. So, this is a history of Israel timeline, just very basic. And we can see over on the left, we're going to start with the flood, about 2400 BC. And there the Nephilim died. You can see he's on the side. Well, the next time that giants are mentioned are in Genesis 12 at the time of Abraham. And that's about 300 years later. And then we really don't hear anything about them again until 770 years after the flood, which is about 470 years after Abraham. We see them during the time of the conquest, where Israel is taking the promised land, and even a little bit before that, when the spies went in 40 years earlier. And then finally, they appear around the time of the kings, of course, the famous David versus Goliath. So that's a little overview of when they appear. But realize, just start thinking about this. If they're appearing at the time of Abraham, and there's a lot of them, as we'll see, 300 years after the flood, that means that they were around well before that. They were already extremely established. So this started much earlier. So right now, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on right now the time of Abraham. We're going to take a look at that. Just a few things as a review to give you a background. If we talk about giants in the Bible, we have the Rephaim in the Hebrew. That's often translated just giant. That's kind of the general term for giants that came from the Nephilim that we'll see in this talk referenced in Numbers 13:33. Then there's the Emim, which is the Moabite name, the Zumim, which is the Ammonite name, the Anakim, which came from a person named Anak in Hebron. And then there's the Amorites. The Amorites are also giants. We have two Amorite kings on the east, King Og of Bashan, who is clearly a giant, King Sidon, probably not. And we have five Amorite kings on the west. None of them are named as giants, but it's possible. Then there is the word which occurs in the time of David of Rapha, which is the singular word for giant, like giant singular, giant versus giants. And then there's Rephai, which it means a member of the clan. And again, we're seeing them present from the time of Abraham to Joshua to David. They are there from the very beginning after the flood. Some of the meanings of their names in the Hebrew, Rephaim just is the word for giant. Emim comes from the Hebrew root for fright, horror, or terror. Zamzumin, the Hebrew root to ponder or plan evil. And Anakim doesn't really have any meaning except that Anak was the father of the Anakim, and the father of Anak was Arba. So let's begin by looking in Genesis 14. This is our main text where this is mentioned. Abraham is now in the promised land, and he is going to have to fight to go and get Lot back. In the 14th year, Kirladamer and the kings that were with him came and attacked the Rephaim and Ashtaroth Karnim, the Zuzim and Ham, the Emim and Shaveth Kirathaim, and the Horites in their mountain of Seir, as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and attacked all the country of the Amalekites and also the Amorites who dwelt in Hazion Tamar. So we're going to see that these guys are already in the land, and we learn if we look in Deuteronomy 2 through 8. I won't read it all for you, but it talks about that the Emim had dwelt there in people in times past. The people as great and as tall as as others regarded that were giants like the Anakim, but the Moabites called them the Emim. So, what we learn from these two passages here, there they are, is that the Rephaim are what's called giants. We have those that highlighted in yellow. We have the Emim highlighted in green. They're the giants that were in the area of Moab. And then we have the Anakim giants. The Anakim giants came from Anak. And then we also had the Zuzim giants. Let's look at a text that goes into a little bit more detail about them in Deuteronomy 2:20. That was also regarded as the land of the giants. Giants or Rephaim formerly dwelt there, but the Ammonites call them Zamzummim or Zumim, a people as great and tall and numerous as the Anakim. And then here's the famous passage about King Og of Bashan, that he was one of the remnant of the giants, and it talks about his bed, how it was 9 cubits in length and 14 cubits wide, according to the standard cubit, and that all the area of Bashan was called the land of the giants. So when we learn from Deuteronomy then is that the Zuzim were also giants, that Og was a Rephaim giant, and the land of Lot and which is Ammon and Moab. Remember that Lot had two sons, Ammon and Moab, and those became regions of people, the Ammonites and the Moabites. That was formerly the land of the giants. And Bashan and Gilead was also called a land of the giants. The thing that we're learning here is that even in Abraham's time, when this Genesis 14 battle occurred, that there were many different giants in different places around the promised land. They were already extremely established, something that many people don't realize when they read that text, because they're not comparing Genesis 14 to what we learn later in Deuteronomy and the conquest. If we look in Joshua 2:10, we read, "For we have heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea, for when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og." And very interesting, later in Scripture, the Lord himself, okay, this is God speaking here. We'll come back to this because it's important. "Yet it was I who destroyed the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of the cedars." Now, a cedar is about 30 to 60 feet high. "And he was as strong as the oaks, yet I destroyed his fruit above and his roots beneath." So Sihon and Og were Amorites, and we know that the Amorites were huge giants. It appears that Og was one of the last, if not the last of them, so maybe Sihon was not, but that's at the time of the conquest. And remember that in Genesis 14, the Amorites were there in part of that list with Abraham. So there were many more of them in the past. So in summary, if we look at this passage from Genesis 14, way early in Abraham's life, what do we learn? There were many giants already by Abraham's day. The Rephaim, the Zuzim, the Emim, and the Amorites. And they continued all the way into the time of Joshua and the conquest, which means that they started much earlier. Let me show you a map here. Here we can see on the left the areas of Israel, and I've overlaid this over the tribal allotments of Israel. That may be more familiar to you. And this is all of the places that are mentioned that the giants dwelt in the time of Abraham. And there were likely many more Nephilim in the promised land. Remember, since Genesis 14 only mentions those involved due to the war. So there were probably, you would guess, some on the other side of the Jordan as well, but we simply don't know that. And then on the right is a diagram of this war with Chedorlaomer's invasion, and it shows you the different giants and where they were with their names. Now, what gets interesting again is if we want to think, okay, well, if they were in there in the time of Abraham, And is this in relation to the ark and the Tower of Babel? So let's take a look. Here is a timeline starting with the ark landing and all of the genealogy that we have down through Peleg. You can see the Tower of Babel there in 1758, down all the way to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So here's where approximately in Abraham's life the giants that were mentioned in 14 were. So you can put them on that timeline there, and then, no, well, if they were there, then they certainly were there for a while before they had to be established, and they probably had to go way back. The question is, how far? Could they have gone all the way back to the Tower of Babel? Possibly. We don't know. It is interesting in that many people equate Nimrod with an ancient, well established mythical historical figure. I think he's real, called Gilgamesh. And Gilgamesh really fits the pattern of a Nephilim, half human, half god. And he was a extremely mighty warrior. It's possible that our Nimrod from the Bible was a Nephilim. We don't know. Um, but we certainly know that they went back probably to the time of Tower of Babel and the dispersion because they were so established in the promised land. This is a timeline of from Abraham all the way to the conquest. We can see at the top left there the giant by the life of Abraham, Genesis 14, and then all the way down on the bottom right there, where Moses and them went into started going into the promised land. They sent the spies, and that's where they saw the first giants there. And that's a span of 430 years between Abraham and the conquest. So that's a lot of time, again, for these giants to be in the promised land, multiplying, building. Remember, America's only 250, 300 years old. Imagine 430 years what these giants, Nephilim, could accomplish. One aside, this information does give us a lot of insight into a verse that we often read but don't understand its context. Again, knowing that the Amorites were giants, well established giants up until the time of Og, who's one of the last, which means in the time of Abraham, they were everywhere and there were lots of them. Because in Genesis 15, after the covenant was made between God and Abraham, where God did it himself, God told Abraham about the Jews returning back to the land after they go down into Egypt. But in the fourth generation, it says, they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And remember, as we just learned, the Amorites are giants. And they were much more established back in the time of Abraham. So, some of this sin wasn't just that they were being bad. Some of it was even wickeder sin, and that now these Amorites are, Nephilim giants back in the land, and the same sin as before the flood. So let's go back to our timeline here, and we can see here's our verse, Genesis 15:16. But in the fourth generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. So we have about, again, 470 years. So approximately from the time that this was spoken to Abraham and the spies see the first giants in the promised land. So again, a long time for that to occur. If we want to look at these giants, again, here they are at the time of Abraham, we learn that God was already beginning between the time of Abraham and the time of the conquest to start to deal with these Amorite nations and some of these giants. Look what it says in Deuteronomy 2:10. The Emim had dwelt there in Moab in times past, a people as great and numerous and tall as the Anakim, so they're giants. They were also regarded as giants, Rephaim, like the Anakim, but the Moabites called them Emim. The Horites formerly dwelt in Seir, but the descendants of Esau dispossessed them and destroyed them from before them and dwelt in their place, just as Israel did to the land of possession which the Lord gave them. So the Moabites had moved out the Emim. I put a little X there through the Emims. And the Edomites, Esau, had moved out the Horites from the area. And in Deuteronomy 2:20, a little further down, it says that was also regarded as the land of the giants. Giants formerly dwelt there, but the Ammonites called them Zanzumim. Again, a people as great and tall and numerous as the Anakim. But the Lord destroyed them from before them and dispossessed them and dwelt in their place. So the Zuzim were also removed. And again, these are the verses that tell you that in Abraham's day, back in Genesis 14, that all those kingdoms that were being mentioned were giant kingdoms, something that's not realized. And now we learn that even before Joshua came into the land, that God had already been executing, the territorial justice long before Israel came into the promised land, just as he had told Abraham that their iniquity was not yet complete. But evidently by the time of Deuteronomy, some of it was already starting and beginning. So let's go back to our timeline here, and now let's look at the second portion where the giants appear in the time of Joshua and the conquest and the spies going into the land. In Numbers 13:33, this is when the spies had come back. And remember that there were four of them. There was Caleb and Joshua, and then there was two others. And two of them were very scared and afraid. And in fact, this caused a judgment. They got the people upset where they had to wander for 40 years. They were afraid to go into the promised land and take victory, even though God had given them the promise that they would have that victory. Look what they say. They say, there we saw the giants. The word there is Nephilim. There we saw the Nephilim. The descendants of Anak came from the Nephilim. And we were like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. So this is very interesting because realize that the gentlemen speaking this are using the word Nephilim and assuming that everyone knows what they're talking about. So again, everyone back then knew the story. There we saw the Nephilim. They didn't have to explain themselves. So what do we learn? Anak and their sons, those other giants that we just saw mentioned, come from the Nephilim, that they were giants. This is the only other mention, just so you know, of the word Nephilim in the Old Testament. It only occurs in Genesis 6, and it only occurs here. There are words that mean giant in other parts, but this is the only one that is giant, like the Rephaim is a different word. And again, here Moses is linking this back to Genesis 6, which the reader would know well. Both parties and perspectives viewed the Anakim as giants. In other words, look what they said, that we were tiny compared to them in our sight. And when they looked at us, they viewed us as tiny. So you have kind of a double confirmation, and we'll come back to this, that they're really that big. Now, you can pause and read all this if you want. This is a longer section in Numbers. I just wanted you to be aware of it where it is. If you want to go and study this yourself, this is the section from Numbers 13:21 through 33. You can see I have a few things highlighted there. In the top, in Hebron, there was Ahaman, Sheshai, Talmai, the descendants of Anak were there. Those are some of the sons of Anak. Look what it says in verse 28. The people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And we saw the descendants of Anak there again. So they must have known about Anak somehow for them to mention it that way. And then at the bottom is the statement that we just studied. This is dealing with the Anakim. So just to summarize what we know about the Anakim, they're a part of the Rephaim. The Rephaim is the general word. Arba was the father of Anak. That's in Joshua 15:13. Arba was the greatest of the Anakim. And Hebron a city you'll see come up in the Old Testament, was formerly named after Arba, Kirijath Arba. So this giant, this Nephilim giant, Anakim, had the city originally named after him. Anak had three sons. The three sons lived in Hebron, and this is where the three spies first saw them. Their other descendants became just known as the Anakim in general, and they're widely dispersed in the Promised Land, Judea, Israel, and even over in Gaza. They came from the Nephilim. Arba, was he the first one, the first generation? We don't know. They were huge in size. We'll come back to this. It's not an exaggeration. Again, we saw that from both perspectives, they were like grasshoppers, and we'll see that even the Lord testifies to this. And a remnant of them remained in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. This will be important when we get to the time of David, but remember that a remnant of them remained. Here's a nice little slide which shows you the family tree from Arba to Anak to the sons of Anak and then the Anakim clans. I won't read these. You can pause this and read them if you want on your own. But these are all the verses that give us this information about these Anakim and their kind of family, their family tree from what we know in Scripture. Very interesting. Now, here is what the giants look like at the time of Joshua from the ones that are mentioned. Again, there's probably more that aren't mentioned, but this is where we see all of them. On the left is the allotments according to tribe where they were, and then on the right is just a more blown up version, and you can see all the places that the giants were. This is something that people don't often realize who study the Bible and the conquest of Joshua, as that there were giants everywhere on both sides, especially in the Promised Land proper on the other side, on the west side. This is a comparison between what we saw in Abraham and the time into Joshua. So on the left is Abraham, on the right is Joshua, and you can see a shift, at least from the ones mentioned, from one side of the Jordan to the other, which makes sense, because on the left side is where the main conquest of Israel will be. Back to our timeline, now what we learn is that the giants are everywhere, all the way through probably. Again, something not commonly recognized. They were a major part of the enemy's plan. So now let's talk a little bit about why. What is the motive? Look at the map there. Why are these giants there in the Promised Land? What's going on? Well, remember before the flood, the Nephilim were there to try and contaminate the genetic line of Messiah. The devil knew that the seed of the woman would bring Messiah. If he can poison that seed, then the Messiah can't come. Well, that failed. And then so after the flood, he realized that's not going to work. And it seems that the plan is to try and block phase two, which is phase two of their plan, block the Israelites from going into the Promised Land. If he can stack it with giants, they won't be able to conquer and take the Promised Land, which he seems to somehow know has some kind of prophetic future. We don't know what details he knows or don't knows. That seems to be the strategic plan of the enemy. So now the question is, were they really giants or hyperbole? Well, I mean, if you just read the Bible and believe what it says, it's clear that they're giants. But you wouldn't believe on the internet, all these people who pontificate, and what they do is eisegesis. They take their own beliefs. They're sitting here in the modern world of 2025, 26, thinking that giants are just a myth, and that's stupid, that's dumb, that's science fiction, and all this kind of stuff, thinking that they know what happened 4,000 years ago, and they don't believe it. So they think, well, the people then must have just been making it up, or it's hyperbolic language. Maybe the guy was 7 or 8 feet tall, but there's no way he was any bigger than that. So let's look again at what the text says. If we look at Numbers 13, 32 to 33, it calls them men of great stature, and they say that they were like grasshoppers. They felt like grasshoppers to the giants, and the giants looked at them as if they were grasshoppers. That's a pretty big discrepancy in size. I mean, that means if this is accurate and not hyperbole, which I don't believe it is, these guys were really big, maybe 30, 40, 50, 60 feet high, for them to call themselves grasshoppers. Let's keep going. Well, if we look at King Og, it says, "For only King Og of Bashan remained of the remnant of the giants. Indeed, his bedstead was an iron bedstead." It emphasizes that. "Is it not Rabbah? In Rabbah of the people of Ammon. 9 cubits is its length, and 4 cubits is its width, according to the standard cubits." So we know that he was an Amorite king. And in Deuteronomy 2:20-21, it says, look what it says, that the people were as great and numerous and as tall as the Anakim for the Zanzumim. So all of these things are describing things very big. As we'll see in a minute, King Og's bed is 6 feet wide and 13 and a half feet long. That's really big. That's not 20 or 30, but that's still way bigger than any human being that we've ever seen. This was a giant man. Let me show you a picture of that. This is a rendition that AI made. I think it did a pretty good job of King Og's bed. And remember, it's interesting that that little tidbit is just kind of inserted in there by the author that, hey, the bed is still there. You can go see it. That's how big it is, and that it was made of iron. Here's a summary slide of what we know of King Og of the Amorites. I'm not going to go through all of it. You can screenshot it, you can pause and look at it, but it goes through all of the details that we have about this King Og and the Amorites. In Deuteronomy 1:26-28, look what it says there, underlined, "The people are greater and taller than we are, and their cities are great and fortified up to heaven. And there we have seen the sons of Anakim there." So they're saying that they're much taller and that their cities are huge, fortified up to heaven. If they were big people, then they probably had giant cities. Again, not the words of hyperbole, but they're just describing what they're seeing. Here's something really interesting that's often missed. And this, again, is when the two spies came back. Look what it says in verse 21. "So they went up and spied out the land from the wilderness of Zin as far as Rehob, near the entrance of Hamath. And they went up through the south and came to Hebron." Remember, Hebron's where the Anakim are. "Ahimin, Sheshai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, were there. Now Hebron was built 7 years before Zone in Egypt. Then they came to the valley of Eshcol, and there they cut down a branch with one cluster of grapes. They carried it between the two of them on a pole. They also brought some of the pomegranates and figs." What people don't stop and think about is that it took 2 men to carry one cluster of grapes. Something really weird and odd is going on here. For it to take 2 men to carry what I can carry normally in my hand. I can carry one little cluster of grapes in my hand. I don't need 2 men to carry it on a pole. Again, this is another rendition of that. So again, there must have been some kind of genetic manipulation or something going on. They were producing gigantic fruit, which would make sense for gigantic people. Well, if you don't believe it, again, this verse you've seen, the Lord himself settles it. Look what God himself says. This is the Lord speaking, not me. "Yet it was I who destroyed the Amorite before them, whose height was like the height of the cedars, and he was as strong as the oak." So God's saying that these men were huge, like cedar trees, which are 30 to 60 feet high. The Lord does it again in Deuteronomy 9. "Hear, O Israel, you are to cross over the Jordan today and go in and dispossess nations greater and mightier than yourself, cities great and fortified up to heaven, a people great and tall, the descendants of the Anakim whom you know, and of whom you heard it said, who can stand before the descendants of Anak?" So all of this language points to them really being very large giants, huge cities, great and tall people, and the fact that the Lord's saying who these people are famous, who can stand before them. because of their size. So I think that puts it to bed for anyone who's willing to just believe the facts of the text. Now, let's move on. A question that many people have: how did the Nephilim return? The answer is actually not hard at all, but let's look at some of the theories. Well, some people say they survived the flood, that maybe they got onto a rock or climbed to the highest mountain, or they just treaded water through the flood and some of them survived, and that's how they got. The other theory, because there's not many possibilities, that they were somehow on board Noah's Ark. One of the sons was a Nephilim. In other words, either Shem, Ham, or Japheth was really a Nephilim. Maybe he wasn't a giant yet. That's what people say. Or one of the wives was pregnant with a Nephilim. And when she got off the ark, then she gave birth. Or the angel simply did it again with women after the flood. So let's look at these. The Nephilim survived the flood. Is this possible? No. Why? Well, Scripture makes it very clear that everything died. It goes out of its way. Look what it says in Genesis 6:17. And behold, I myself am bringing floodwaters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh, and which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. Now, this also puts to bed the ridiculous idea that some people think it wasn't a global flood. That's a topic for another day, but just realize that this refutes that also. Look what Genesis 7 says after the flood. And all flesh died. Verse 22, in all whose nostrils was the breath of the spirit of life, all that it was on the dry land died. He destroyed all living things which are on the face of the earth, both man and cattle, creeping thing, and birds of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those with him who were on the ark remained alive. So nobody survived the flood. They've been on board. One of the sons was a Nephilim. One of the wives was pregnant. No, this makes God not able to accomplish his will, that if his goal was to destroy the Nephilim and get them off, then he wasn't capable of doing that. They outsmarted God if somehow he snuck on board or had one of the women pregnant. So what do? Let's go back to the text and read it. Genesis 6:1-4. Now it came to pass, when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves of all whom they chose. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, for he is indeed flesh. Yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants on the earth in those days. And look, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. So when fallen angels had sex with women, they produced Nephilim before and after the flood. It's a simple explanation. It's exactly what the text says, that the angels did it again. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and bore children to them. Remember that this is being written by Moses hundreds of years after the flood. People knew the story, and so when he says, and also afterward, he's referring before and after the flood. And simply the angels did it again. And people say, well, wait a minute, God put those angels in jail. He did, but only the angels that committed the crime. There's plenty of more angels left to commit the same sin, and evidently God allowed it. Now, the last thing we want to consider here is the utter destruction in the conquest. If we look at that, there are multiple people groups and nations: Sihon, Og, Jericho, Ai, the southern cities, Hazor, and the 7 Canaanite nations. They were condemned by God to be utterly destroyed. Men, women, children, sometimes even the animals. This is something that people get really upset about, that a loving God, why would he destroy even innocent women and children or animals? That's not a God that I want to follow. And I understand that, but there are answers. And could it be linked to the Nephilim in the land? Since not everyone is getting this utter destruction order from the Lord. Let me just show you this. The key verse here that talks about it in general is Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 2. When the Lord your God brings you into the land which you go to possess and has cast out many nations before you, the Hittites, the Gersites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations greater than mighty than you. And when the Lord your God deliver them over to your hand, you shall conquer them and utterly destroy them. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. So they were to be utterly destroyed, men, women, children, everybody. And we see in Scripture that this happened to Sihon, the Amorite king. Men, women, little ones of every city, we left none remaining. King Og, when his kingdom was destroyed, it was utterly destroyed. The men, the women, the children of every city. Jericho, the same thing, utterly destroyed. In the northern and southern conquests, Joshua went into the southern Amorite kingdom where there were the 5 kings of the Amorites, and they killed everyone there in the cities of Makkedah, Eglon, Debir, Lachish, Hebron, and Libnah. And remember that Hebron was formerly Kiriath Arba from the father of the Anakim. Then they went to the northern kingdom and got the cities of Hazor, Madron, Shimron, Akpashdor, and other northern kings, and they utterly destroyed them. And then in Joshua 11:21, it says, and at that time Joshua cut off the Anakim from the mountains, from Hebron, from Debir, for all the mountains of Judah and all the mountains of Israel. He utterly destroyed them with their cities. So they went in and destroyed them. If we look, there were 3 layers of this promised land conquest. There was a land inheritance mandate. In other words, God gave them a very large piece of real estate, and they were to possess it and remove anyone in it. But not everyone was condemned to annihilation, or in the Hebrew, harem. Harem is the word that means utterly destroyed. It was only against certain Canaanite groups. The 7 Canaanite nations were the main ones mentioned in the text of Deuteronomy. And then there was the historical failure to finish the conquest. So not all of the groups were removed. Not all of the land was taken. The point is that some groups were given this order by God and some groups were not. Well, who was not? Well, explicitly spared, God says, was Ammon and Moab. They came from Lot. Edom was spared explicitly by God. They came from Esau. The Gibeonites were a Hivite group, and they were spared by treaty. They kind of tricked Israel into deceiving. They deceived Israel into creating a covenant with them, and so they did not get destroyed, and God told them they had to honor it. The reason of Gaza and the Philistines was part of the land grant, but not annihilation. God never told them they needed to utterly destroy the area of the Philistines and the reason of Gaza, but due to disobedience of Israel, they were not removed from the land. Under the mandate, other than the 7 nations, we had Jerusalem, which was under Jebusite control. It was not taken in Joshua's day, but Joshua did include the king of Jerusalem in the coalition defeated, and remember that the Jebusites were named under the 7 nations. But it says in Joshua 15:63 that Judah could not drive out the Jebusites from the land. And Judges 1:21 repeats that Benjamin did not drive them out. It didn't happen, in fact, until the time of David. So this is just a prime example of a target people who remained, not because God exempted them, but because Israel didn't complete the removal at the time. And then there's many other small cities in the Promised Land. They were spared because Israel didn't finish the job either. Multiple Canaanite enclaves in Jerusalem. You can look at them. I'm not going to list them for you. You can pause the slide. The scripture is clear for the reasons for annihilation. If we look in Deuteronomy 9:5, God says it is not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart that you go in to possess their land, but because of the wickedness of these nations that your Lord your God drives them out from before you, that he may fulfill the word of the Lord which he swore to your fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In Deuteronomy 20, he says, but of the cities of these people which the Lord your God gives you as an inheritance, you shall let nothing that breathes remain alive, but you shall utterly destroy them, the Hittite, the Amorite, and the Canaanite, and the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite, just as the Lord your God has commanded you, lest they teach you to do according to all their abominations which they have done for their gods, and you sin against the Lord your God. So we knew that they were extremely wicked. We know that they were doing all kinds of awful child sacrifice. God's protecting the covenant that he made with them. And again, some of these are Nephilim. Does that have something to do with it? I think it certainly does. It's not the only reason, but we know that they needed to be destroyed in the pre-flood time because they were hybrids. They are not something that's even natural. If we look at other reasons, look what it says there in verse 4. You're to utterly destroy them, for they will turn your sons away from following me to serve other gods. So there's multiple reasons, but I think that one clearly is that the Nephilim hybrids were in many of these areas, and they could have been infested for all we know, and that will be a reason that you needed to destroy everyone. It's a possible other reason. And just remember that if the Lord has children and babies killed, he spares them growing up in this evil nation, spares them being sacrificed as a child in a cancerous culture that would ended up sending them to hell. And so he saves them eternally. It's actually an act of mercy from an eternal perspective. We view everything from an earthly perspective. But if you have children that would either be burned alive, which is what they would do if they would put them on the god of Moloch, on the burning hands, and the ancient historians tell us that they would beat the drums very loud so that you couldn't hear the screams of the child as it was dying and being sacrificed. Crazy, but true. It's a whole nother talk, a whole nother story. But if he spares them that, and then if they grow up in this culture, they're probably going to believe everything, believe the false gods, and end up going to hell. But if they are taken out of this evil world early, don't have to grow in it, don't have to suffer, they're innocent. They haven't had any chance to respond to God. In my opinion, they clearly go to heaven. Jesus died for everything that ever lived. He takes them to heaven. He spares them from going up. And so the very people who accuse God of being bad, he's actually good. He's saving lots of people by taking them out of a wicked culture before. We view if you leave this world as something bad, but it's actually something good. If you're going to heaven, you're better off. You're better off dying as a baby and going right to heaven than having to live in this world, especially if you're not going to make it or you're going to be sacrificed as a child sacrifice. So I hope that helps and understands. And here's just a comparison of the areas on the left that were to be utterly destroyed. So I put little giants there around those 7 nations. You have Deuteronomy 7. I've listed the 7 nations, and I've put on the map where they are. And then the giants mentioned in the conquest on the right. And you can see it doesn't overlap exactly, but there's some interesting similarities as to the locations of the giants and the conquest. So again, I think that this definitely had something to do with it. Now I'm going to quickly do one quick little very interesting run through some archaeological fascinating fact as it relates to King Og. I'm going to make a separate video where we go around the world looking at all these different structures, but I think this one is fitting here. There is a place in the land which would have been Israel called Gilgal Rephaim. That's what it's called today, Gilgal Rephaim. Remember, Rephaim means giant. And Gilgal Rephaim are these circular stone structures. Now, from above, you're looking from above, it doesn't look that impressive, does it? But it actually is, because that's just a pretty high above picture. Let me explain what this is. It's like the Stonehenge of Israel. It's dated to 3000 BC or earlier. You can only see it from above, and there's 45,000 large stones. And it aligns exactly with the summer solstice. So it's a very complicated and complex structure. Here's another view, aerial view above, and you can see in the center, there's kind of the central little temple there, okay? And if you can go, you can walk down through. There's a hole. You can actually go down inside, and there's a kind of a schematic map of all the different sections of it. Here's what it looks like if you're just on the ground. It just looks like some piles of rocks. It doesn't look that impressive. But when you see how big it is, and there's some people standing on it, and how many rocks were placed there, and look, there's no rocks around there. Where did these rocks come from? Who put them there? Who moved that many rocks to build this gigantic structure? And again, from above, it's perfect circles, concentric rings. It's 511 feet across. There's a hole that in the temple area which perfectly aligns with the summer solstice. There's some going down, they're going inside. And what's really interesting, if that's what it looks like if you're at 6 feet, but if you're 13 feet tall, you can see this. And if you're 20 feet tall, now you can begin to see it. So it's like unless you're a giant, you can't even see the structure. You have to be very, very tall. Now, what's fascinating is that if you look on the map, as we zoom out, look where this structure sits. It should ring bells. It is exactly where King Og had his kingdom. Is this from his time? We don't know, but it clearly seems to be a structure built by giants. Again, just something really, really interesting. There's a lot more we could talk about on that, but I wanted to sneak that in there for you. Now, let's go back to our timeline and remember that we're going to now go to the time of David. And here's where we're going to see why. It tells us in Joshua. Look at the top left there. At that time, Joshua came and cut off the Anakim from the mountains, from Hebron, from Debir, and from Anab. From all the mountains of Judah and from all the mountains of Israel, Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. None of the Anakim were left in the land of the children of Israel. They remained only in Gaza and Gath and Ashdod. They remained there. Okay, now let's look down here at our map. So they remained there for 350 years. It's about 350 years from the time of Joshua to the time of David and when he fights Goliath. Again, that's a long time for these giants to be remaining in the land. So now let's go to the time of David and Goliath. Goliath is called a Rapha, or giant. That's the singular Hebrew word for giant. Rephaim, right, is the plural. In 1 Samuel 17, 4-7, we have a description of Goliath. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines named Goliath, from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head. He was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a beaver's weem, and his iron spear weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went out before him. So Rapha is singular for giants, or Rephaim. He was about 9 feet tall. His armor weighed 125 pounds, and his spear tip weighed 15 pounds. Now again, realize these are details put in there on purpose to show you how big he was and how heavy and large his armor and weapons were. Here's some more information. You may want to go and look this up on your own. I'm not going to read it all, but there are some brothers of Goliath that are described, and they again are described as being giant with a very large spear, men of great stature, and that he had 4 brothers, so there were 5 of them. This is also detailed in Chronicles. Again, you can pause and read all that if you want to. I just put that in there for completeness. There's this supposed discrepancy where actually who killed Goliath. One of the texts reads that Goliath did it. One of them reads that Elhanan did it. And it appears it's just a scribal error where in the text from Samuel, it was probably removed from or it got put out by accident. But here's a little blurb there in the NET Bible notes if you want to explore that supposed discrepancy. But it's just a little scribal error, no big deal. Was Goliath really a giant? There's people who say that he is not. Why? Well, The Masoretic text, which is the main Hebrew text of 1 Samuel, said his height was 6 cubits in a span. That's about 9 feet 6 inches. This is the traditional Hebrew text preserved by Jewish scribes. But the Septuagint, which is a Greek translation of the Old Testament, written about 200, 300 BC, and the Dead Sea Scrolls say that he was only 4 cubits in a span. Well, now he's only 6 feet 6 inches. He's not a giant. That's found in the Greek Septuagint and 4Q Sam A, Dead Sea Scroll Mariner. So what are the possibilities? Where it's an accidental scribal error, the Hebrew numerals were written with letters. Some of the characters are similar but could be miscopied. And the numbers are statistically the most corrupted elements in ancient texts and their copying. It could be an intentional reduction. Some scholars suggest that later scribes found the height was unbelievable. They didn't believe in giants, just like most people don't today. It couldn't mean that, so we better take that height down. They corrected it downward for realism. This is speculative, but not provable. The key point, though, is that the shorter reading is earlier, but earlier does not automatically mean original. But again, if you just read your Bible in context, you know what the answer is. He was clearly a giant. Why? Well, his armor is incompatible with a 6 foot 6 inch man, right? It says that it weighed 130 pounds. No 6 foot 6 man can wear armor, weighing half of his body weight. He wouldn't be able to move around. His spearhead alone was 17 pounds, right? And it's just not feasible to wear that much armor, right? Ancient armor was not ergonomically distributed, even like modern gear. This armor fits the description of a giant, not just a tall athlete. And the narrative collapses if Goliath is merely 6 foot 6 inches tall. What do I mean? Well, Saul was likely very tall himself, probably 6 foot, and then he should have fought him. David's fearlessness becomes less remarkable. Israel's army being terrified becomes irrational. The text repeatedly emphasizes the shock and dread that this man caused. If he was not really big, none of that makes sense. So he was big, sorry. And Goliath is explicitly linked to the Rephaim and his 4 brothers, which I just showed you, right? Goliath of Gath. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did some of the Anakim remain. He was an Anakim. And 2 Samuel lists the 4 giants from Gath, all described as men of extraordinary size. One had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes, which is a genetic gigantism marker. These men are all explicitly called the descendants of Rapha, the giant, right? And the Rapha, the Rephaim, is always associated with unusual size, exceptional strength, and pre-Israelite giant clans. And even genetic abnormalities support it with the polydactyly. This has a known correlation with pituitary giantism. So we're not dealing with mythological language. Now, let's look at David's sling and a stone. Some skeptics say, these guys crack me up, if David could kill him with a stone, Goliath couldn't have been that big. Completely incorrect. Why? Well, ancient slingers could launch stones at 90 to 150 miles per hour. A stone could easily fracture his skull bone, cause internal bleeding and hemorrhage and death. Height increases lethality, actually, because a larger skull has a higher center of mass, a slower, the giant would also have a slower reaction time, and it's easier to shatter a big sphere than a small one. David's weapon does not argue against Goliath's size. Just a few interesting facts here. You can screenshot these, write them down. I just have a table for you of Goliath and his 4 brothers and the relevant scriptures. Here's a little caricature of Rapha the father and his 4 brothers. And it's interesting that David, it says in 1 Samuel 17:40 that he chose 5 smooth stones from the brook. He chose 5, and there were 5 giants. Is that why? I mean, we don't know, but it is interesting, isn't it? And so, if we look in summary here, at all of the locations of the Nephilim in Israel through history. They were everywhere, and something, again, that people don't realize. The left and the right are the same. It's just two different maps, but it shows you according to the time of Abraham, and then from the time of the when Israel had their different tribes. But the locations are the same. It's just showing you different regions for geography. So to summarize the giants that were conquered in the Bible, Moses defeated Og. Joshua cut off the Anakim in various parts of the country. Caleb drove out the three sons of Anak from Hebron, and then David and his men killed Goliath and all of his brothers. And it lists that there, and you have, again, the diagram for it. So that's our talk on the giants after the flood. That's about as comprehensive as we can get, and I hope that that helps you understand. Thank you, and have a good day.